Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Promoter Eddie Hearn has very publicly confirmed that American heavyweight Jarrell Miller is at the front of the queue to face unified champion Anthony Joshua next, if both men win their upcoming fights. As we know, Joshua is of course in training to face Joseph Parker March 31st, and Miller he will meet Johann Duhaupas April 28th. So prior to a news conference related to that April event, which is being held at the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, Hearn told BoxingSing.com, should his charge Anthony Joshua get past Parker, Miller will get a shot at Joshua in his following fight. So what I'm going to do is get to the quotes first and then some thoughts, because there is quite a bit to unpick. You pull one thread and another comes loose as well. A lot to talk about. In respect of Miller taking on Duhaupas, Eddie Hearn says, "This is the fight for me where I think Jarrell Miller really stakes his claim to challenge for the world heavyweight title. And while Deontay Wilder continues to live at a street address on Fantasy Island, this Joshua Miller is the fight that we will look to make in August. And I'm already in talks with the Barclays Center's Brett Yormark that all being well on March 31st, New York is the venue for Anthony Joshua's next fight. If that's not against Deontay Wilder, Jarrell Miller will be the guy if he can get the win against Duhaupas. That's the plan, and again, we have to win on March 31st, and AJ's not even thinking about August. It's not like we're overlooking Parker. It's my job to plan the future, and the future is a fight in America in 2018. For Anthony Joshua to come to Brooklyn and fight a kid out of Brooklyn for the heavyweight world title, that's a big fight, but we need the excuse from Jarrell for people to say, that's a good fight. And that will come with a dominant victory against Duhaupas, if he can get it. I think it's a very tough fight for Jarrell Miller, but if he can look good and he can win, I'm ready to give him a shot." Those were the quotes from Eddie Hearn, Anthony Joshua's promoter, and it must be noted he also has a promotional arrangement with Jarrell Miller. Now, quite a few things at play there with all that. First, Hearn's comments back up what Miller has been saying very publicly, that he's been promised a fight with Anthony Joshua after his next fight. Many of us did take those statements with a grain of salt at the time because the landscape of the division is such, with unifications and mandatories on the horizon, that we didn't really sort of see that as potentially being the next fight. If he keeps winning, sure, he'll get a shot eventually. And also the other thing is potentially there are better options out there for Anthony Joshua and the other champions than Jarrell Miller. So a few names could be ahead of him in the queue. Just in people's minds, that is. So more on all that in a moment, but what Hearn has done, he's vindicated Miller's previous statements. But also he's very publicly put a peg in the ground on what's next should AJ beat Joseph Parker. The cynic in me would suggest that what Eddie Hearn is doing here, he's trying to leverage the prospect of a future Anthony Joshua fight to try and lure in more interest for the April 28th Miller vs Duhaupas clash, and also the broader card which is headlined by Danny Jacobs. Remember, Matchroom is still a fledgling entity in the United States. They've only had a few cards and they want to make them as big as possible. So dropping AJ's name in there, that could potentially help. Not a bad tactic, and it gives the impression something is at stake for that Miller vs Duhaupas fight. We've also heard that it's a WBA eliminator, whatever that means, because we know Alexander Povetkin is the mandatory. More on him soon as well. But it could potentially draw some more punters in, and it is a real carrot for Miller to perform well. And when Eddie Hearn says we need the excuse from Jarrell for people to say that's a good fight, he's actually bang on. Because right now, fans are not clamoring for that matchup. If you think they are, I have to completely disagree with you. He's a few cabs down the rank at the moment. Right now, Jarrell Miller, he's seen as a contender, in my view, that's largely on a par with about a half a dozen to 10 other guys. He's there or thereabouts, but there has been nothing that he has done to separate himself from the pack. I was actually saying in a recent tweet, and you can follow me, boxing_squared, that Miller, he has proved he's elite with his mouth and what he says, how he conducts himself in the media. But he's a bit unproven on the boxing side. He hasn't proven he's elite with his boxing. In general, he's looked Pretty good against guys like Gerald Washington and Marius Wok, but not spectacular. The more I see of him, the more I'm actually convinced that his style is not especially conducive to being super fan friendly. What he does is he wears guys down with his relentless pressure and his high punch output, rather than wowing you with any one thing. He's got the W's recently, but it's not like he's won in spectacular fashion. So if we do get another of those performances against Duhaupas on April 28th, which I would say there's a high chance of, where does that actually leave things? Does that improve his stock? I mean, you could actually make an argument, even if he knocks out Johann Duhaupas spectacularly, does that really mean much? At the end of the day, he would have beaten a B-level fighter that's on the slide. Someone he was expected to beat handily anyway. So either way, I'm not convinced that Duhaupas is actually the opponent that will spark massive casual fan interest in Jarrell Miller. If he KO'd someone like a Dillian Whyte, for example, now I believe that would probably help more. He's a bigger profile, a bit more brash, potentially seen slightly higher in the pecking order than Duhaupas right now. I mean, what really would have been ideal if there had have been a fighter, say, he gets a good win over a popular, incredible American heavyweight. But unfortunately, those are thin on the ground right now. So what they've done instead is target Johann Duhaupas, who's a highly beatable fighter, who's actually ranked across 3 sanctioning bodies. And if we just pivot here for a second, in terms of Anthony Joshua making an American debut, putting aside that he has to get past Joseph Parker, because we know that, say he does though, Jarrell Miller, he would serve as a good introduction. Someone who is seen as credible, a guy on the cusp of the top 10, or potentially inside, depending how you look at things, who would be able to sell the fight with his colourful antics and the things he says. And the fact that he has a co-promotional arrangement with Eddie Hearn, it helps massively. It keeps all the money in-house, and potentially the belts if AJ was upset unexpectedly. But in reality, should that fight ever get made, I see it as more of a stepping stone for Joshua. Expose him to the large US market and help generate some buzz for his next American-based fight. I mean, right now the market for Joshua in the States, it's a little bit unclear. We know he has a degree of popularity, but it's not like he's been taking over. He's got a lot of potential, he's very popular elsewhere. But there's no guarantee that he takes over right off the bat. So break into the market with a Joshua vs Miller sort of fight, in which AJ would be heavily favoured to win and potentially score a spectacular knockout. It would be a solid move to start with a Miller type fight. The thing that sticks out immediately to me is that if Joshua beats Parker in March, he's got 3 belts, which means he's going to have 3 mandatory challenger obligations to fulfill for each sanctioning body. Not right away, but some of them could be. I mean, there's been much speculation, and some of this has actually even been fanned by Eddie Hearn himself, that the WBA will order the winner of Joshua Parker to face their mandatory challenger, Alexander Povetkin. Remember, a WBA mandatory has not been called for a long time. I mean, what has also fueled the narrative is the fact that Alexander Povetkin, he will be fighting on the Parker-Joshua undercard against David Price. If I was Alexander Povetkin, hearing all this talk from Hearn and Miller and about Miller being next in August, I'd be wondering what exactly is going on here. If Hearn really does want Miller next, he could probably exert some pressure on the WBA. We actually saw this in 2017 when Luis Ortiz was trying to get Joshua to fight him, or be stripped, that the WBA, it actually fell into line behind its champion, and it allowed the IBF mandatory to be taken care of first. So I think if Hearn was to really push the issue, he probably could make some headway. Another thing to consider though is Miller is ranked at number 3 in the WBA, WBO and IBF respectively, so he's number 3 in all 3. Povetkin has the WBA and WBO sewn up in terms of the top spot, but the IBF, it's wide open. So it's possible Jarrell Miller, he could be made the mandatory challenger for AJ's prized IBF strap. That was the first belt he won. It's his favourite. He said that publicly. And I don't think it's actually that far-fetched. especially considering the number 1 slot, it's currently not rated, and at number 2 is Kubrat Pulev, who has actually twice now either avoided a shot at AJ back in 2016 or pulled out through injury, which was 2017. Miller will have a strong case to make for the mandatory spot if he beats Duhaupas, so there'd be Duhaupas, Washington and Wok, who had beaten his last 3 opponents, guys that probably, all top 30 guys or so. And remember, Duhaupas, he's also ranked by the IBF, so it's going to help his cause. A related but important question for me is, how much of all this is Eddie Hearn just gassing it up? How much of it is hot air? He could well be counting on the WBA to order the Povetkin fight next, which legitimately allows him to say, well, hang on guys, AJ, he's got to face Povetkin or lose the belt. He's got to take care of that first. I think that could be a likely scenario that would come into play. But, on the other side, you never know. Whatever the case is, I'm sure that the WBA, as it's already shown to do, will cede to its popular champion and his wishes while it continues to collect hefty sanctioning fees. Remember, these sanctioning bodies rely on big sanctioning fees. So it's highly unlikely that they're going to, follow through on a threat to strip AJ, because he's the cash cow, he brings in the money. Another possible motive, and this is something I was thinking about, apart from appearing to be genuine to Jarrell Miller, maybe Eddie Hearn feels he needs to actually start to shut down some of this chatter about Anthony Joshua not wanting to fight in the US. Joshua himself has definitely seemed a bit lukewarm on the idea, because he says he likes how everything's going right now, how it's all panning out campaigning in the UK. He's effectively said, why try to fix something that's not broken? And there's another thing I'm going to throw into the mix here. When have you actually heard Anthony Joshua say that he's got a burning desire to face Jarrell Miller? I can't off the top of my head remember when. Maybe he has, but it's not something that he's been repeating a lot. I've heard him talk about unification, Joseph Parker, Deontay Wilder, and I've also heard him say he'd like a Dillian Whyte rematch. And I've heard Eddie Hearn talk about a Dillian Whyte rematch. He brings that up quite a bit actually. But I've never really heard Anthony Joshua talk in any real length about Jarrell Miller. What we do know is that Joshua calls the shots on his opponents, not Hearn. So we do need to keep that in mind when weighing up what Eddie Hearn is saying. And just to sort of sum up here, it's fair to say that these comments about AJ versus Miller for August, it's certainly thrown the cat amongst the pigeons. When it was Miller alone saying these things, it kind of like, well, of course he would say these things, but how credible was it? But Hearn has added that veneer of credibility to it, makes us think, actually, is this a possibility? I'm not so sure, I'm not convinced yet. I do think the WBA will order Povetkin next, and we will see that in August or there or thereabouts. The other thing though, with it all, is Eddie Hearn is doing his job. He's trying to create interest. He's trying to create and manufacture potential credible future opponents for Anthony Joshua. He can't just sit on his laurels. In terms of Miller though, whether he fits the bill as someone as a credible opponent, mostly, but he's not quite there. That's not exactly the fight I would want to see next if Joshua beats Joseph Parker. I would definitely need to see more than a beatdown on a fading Johann Duhaupas to convince me that he is ready for a title shot. How about you? And just quickly, the presser from New York, Jarrell Miller, he says, come April 28th, the French fry is gonna get cooked, while Johann Duhaupas says this is the most important fight of his career. Miller is a great talent and a dangerous fighter, but this is a huge chance for me and I won't let it slip by. And despite the comments from Eddie Hearn, which he also said to Boxing Scene that this is a 50-50 fight, the comedy routine is in action again. It's not a 50-50 fight. It's 80-20 to Miller, and that's probably, being charitable to Duhaupas. I don't see Duhaupas. I mean, there's been a few people that have actually called me out on this and said they think Duhaupas is going to be a better opponent than I initially forecast on my previous Heavyweight News and Brief 19 video. But I kind of see this panning out as a, he'll put up a good effort for maybe half a dozen rounds. He'll never really trouble him, and I expect Miller to sort of take over and stop him late on. We'll have to see. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.